Today I want to talk about 6 fallacies of presumption, arguments in which the premises are insufficient to prove the conclusion. So, first let's consider the problem of an argument containing a hasty generalization. That's a problem based on primarily a poor or insufficient sample. But how large the sample has to be depends on what's being generalized. For example, how many times do you have to boil a pot of water to figure out what's the boiling pot? It's 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But the only variable that suggests you might want to boil water at 2 different sea levels is the variable of air pressure. Compare that with how many people would you have to poll to make a good prediction about who we're going to elect as president in the next presidential election, November 2020. One book, Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics, argued that a good poll, a good sample, a sufficiently large sample of the American electorate on the issue of who we're going to elect in a presidential election needs to contain only 1,600 people. But it can still be a hasty generalization, a bad prediction, if the 1,600 people aren't different enough from one another. So this is the issue of, before you want to make a generalization about who people are voting for, you want to know what are the relevant subgroups that need to be included in order to make up a representative sample. So the socio and economic class, you want to have members of each socioeconomic class included, race and ethnicity, sex and gender, geographical location, religion, level of education, profession, and political party. These are the relevant subgroups that could affect who you're voting for. Not relevant would be people that have an eye color of blue and brown and people that are small, medium, or large or extra large. In the last election, the reason why the polls made a poor prediction apparently was due to the number of working males that didn't pick up the cell phone when they were polled. Okay, and compare that with the 1948 presidential election, Truman versus Thomas Dewey. Well, they only called people that had telephones, so they used the phone book to base the poll on, whereas most people in 1948 didn't have phones. So the explanation of why a sample upon which a generalization is based may be insufficient is, number one, the sample's too small. And as I said, that's relative to the number of relevant subgroups. Relevant to what? Relevant to what's being said in the generalization. An unrepresentative sample, that means the sample doesn't include all the relevant subgroups. And finally, the sample has not been procured in a random way. A random sample entails that everyone that's included in the generalization must have had an equal opportunity to be included in the sample. For example, if I ask students in a 9:30 a.m. logic class if we have a parking problem at Aquinas and they said no, all the people that are taking evening classes that are commuters or have a day job would not have been included in the sample. And so it's not a random sample. It's not a good generalization. Or here's another example. If I took a poll of all the people riding the number 6 bus to Woodland Mall and asked them if they would ride more often if the bus was more available, bus lines were more available. However, the people that never ride the bus haven't been included in the sample. And that's the people you want to touch base with in terms of, should we increase the bus lines in Grand Rapids? So the structure of an argument which has a hasty generalization fallacy in it, the premises will be an unrepresentative sample, and the conclusion will be a hasty generalization. Okay, so here's a good example. If I asked all the 20 to 40-year-olds that I know if they're socially distancing and wearing masks, and they say yes, absolutely, I can't make a generalization that all American people between the ages of 20 and 40 are socially distancing and wearing masks. You want certain relevant subgroups to be included, not just people that I know. For example, what's their education level? What's their religious affiliation? What's their political party? And what is the size of their extended family? And are they regular party goers, social gathering goers? Okay, what's the problem with asking men at Woodland Mall what's their ideal relationship with a woman if all the men I asked said monogamous marriage with both parties faithful? Well, obviously, the men that are going to Woodland Mall aren't necessarily middle class socioeconomic people, because wealthy men probably won't go to the mall. They can have somebody order for them, and poor men don't have a reason to go window shopping at the mall. So it's mainly based on middle-aged men, all that are there probably with their wives or their girlfriends. And the mall in Woodland does not include men of other geographical locations. The men polled in San Francisco would not likely to say that their ideal relationship with a woman is a monogamous marriage with both parties faithful. And again, given that your religious views may affect your attitudes about relationship with women if you're a man, as well as your profession, education level, as I said, socioeconomic class, um, race, ethnicity, etc. Okay, let's switch over to a generalization which unfortunately has a similar name to the hasty generalization. That's the fallacy of sweeping generalization. In the sweeping generalization, in the structure of that argument, there's a good generalization in the premises. But that good generalization in the conclusion is misapplied to the exceptional case. So don't assume that if you're looking at an argument that's based on exceptional cases, that that's a sweeping generalization. Because if the premises are based on exceptional cases, the conclusion will be a poor generalization. Examples: everyone has the right to personal freedom in the personal realm. Therefore, conclusion, I have a right to smoke. The reason why smoking in the presence of others is not a matter of personal freedom or the self regarding realm is because there's the problem of secondhand smoke. Or what about this one? Children should be seen and not heard, which basically means kids shouldn't interrupt adult conversations. Children should be seen and not heard. Therefore, I didn't have to listen to the kids crying for help in the swimming pool. Here's another example. Most people are pretty moral by nature. Conclusion: I don't have to worry about letting my family or friends know my credit card information. The critical reason for sweeping generalization is to state the good generalization and explain why it's being misapplied to the exceptional case in the conclusion. Compare that with the critical reasoning for the hasty generalization, where you're mainly describing all the relevant subgroups that should be included in what counts as a representative sample. Third fallacy is called both the fallacy of bifurcation and the fallacy of false dilemma. What's occurring in a argument with a bifurcation or false dilemma is that the author of the argument falsely claims that there are two alternatives only, and that A and B both can't be true. So the structure in the premise would be either A or B and not both. And then if it claims in the premise A, therefore not B, that could be erroneous. That could be false because, as a matter of fact, it could be both. Similarly, if you have a fallacy of false dilemma where it's not a problem of both alternatives A and B being true, even though in the argument it says both can't be true, are arguments where there are other alternatives C, D, E, and F. Example: either A, you're for me, or B, you're against me, and not both. A, I think you're for me, therefore not B, I don't think you're against me. But both can be true depending on whether you agree with my beliefs, values, and actions. You may be uh, for this other person on some issues and against this other person based on other issues or other forms of his or her action. Okay, here's another example. In the United States, we don't have a Good Samaritan law, which means that unless you're a medical professional or a lifeguard or similarly qualified professionals, paramedic, you don't have a legal obligation to rescue anybody. A 2-year-old could be drowning in a puddle of water, and as a passerby, you don't have a legal obligation to save that kid's life. Now, the debate about whether we should have a Good Samaritan law in the US pretty much makes it an either or bifurcation. Either we can make it a crime not to help anybody in need or everybody in need, or we cannot criminalize any actions, regardless of how difficult it is. What is the cost to you of rescuing that person? Okay, so the alternative, of course, is to only criminalize actions in which there's no cost to a rescuer. You see an offense being committed and you dial 911 to get some help. What is it going to cost you to dial 911? Okay, so if you have a fallacy of false dilemma or bifurcation, here's the critical reasoning. First of all, provide a complete statement of the two alternatives. What's the A? What's the B sentence? Show that either they're not exhaustive, there could be a C, D, or E alternative, or show that they're not exclusive. Both can be true. The next group of fallacies are categorized by the book as all examples of begging the question. And in your homework on the quiz, you can call all four of these arguments, all four of these forms of question begging arguments, the fallacy of begging the question. An argument begs the question when it makes a controversial claim that needs to be supported, but that support isn't provided. The first form is called circular reasoning. And what occurs in the fallacy of circular reasoning? The conclusion is the same as the premise supporting it, but it's just stated in different words. Example: here's my conclusion. The death penalty is justified. Here's my premise. The death penalty is needed to balance the scales of justice. Pretty much saying the same thing, just in more metaphorical terms. Here's another one. Husband comes home from work and tells his wife, I shouldn't have to help with the housework. That's women's work. Well, that's what he's saying when he says he shouldn't have to help with the housework, because he's a man and his wife is a woman and that's woman's work. Okay, so state the question that's been begged. The death penalty is justified. I shouldn't have to help with the housework, and show what the author should have provided in terms of support for that claim. Begging the question isn't the same as evading the issue or changing to a different subject. It's a claim made that has to be supported, but there's no support. Second form of question begging, a controversial conclusion is being claimed, based on a controversial premise. Example, similar to the one previously. The death penalty is justified. Why? Because the death penalty is needed for deterrence. There is a sufficient amount of research on whether the death penalty functions as a deterrent, which claims that it doesn't. There are problems, of course, getting a good sample because different states have crimes defined differently and different prosecutorial practices. But what deters a person who's thinking about committing a crime is not what might happen in 15 years after he's arrested, sentenced to capital punishment, and then sits on death row for a number of years. It's what is the most fear inducing factors in the present. Like, if I don't take a gun to rob this bodega, I may get shot. Okay, similarly, the other argument about men's work and women's work, here's an example of question begging. Let's say you're arguing that the sexual division of labor is justified. There's women's work and there's men's work. And you claim that the sexual division of labor is natural. Men are naturally stronger, men are naturally more aggressive, and you're arguing women are naturally more maternal, and so they should do the domestic work and the child rearing. That's a controversial claim as well. It's not allowing for the fact that both of these might be cultural. Of course, it's not cultural how strong you are, but for the most part, men are capable of cleaning the house and raising the kids, and women are capable of fighting in frontline combat troops. Okay, which they're doing now. Third, question begging epithet. That's just labeling, categorizing without the necessary support. My example, all Republicans are Trumpists, all Democrats are socialists. Finally, the fallacy of complex question occurs when, in the asking of a question, a prior or subsidiary question is begged. For example, this one's right out of the book. Who made God? Well, that begs the question of whether God exists and God is a being that can be created or made. Or here's another one. Haven't the welfare recipients in Grand Rapids milked the taxpayers long enough? Well, first you have to say what counts as their welfare payments is an example of milking. Another example of a question begging a complex question. I'm asking the question, why are good people always punished and bad people always rewarded? Well, first you have to show that that's true before you can ask why is that true? So in all these cases, state the question that's been begged and show what's needed to support it. Special pleading fallacy is basically the same as what we often refer to as a double standard. In the premises, one standard is being applied to oneself and one's in-group, and another standard is being applied to everyone else. So, here's my example. The 75 mile per hour speed limits on the highways in Michigan, they're a good idea for everybody else. But I'm an experienced driver and I can drive 85. Well, there's not a relevant difference between licensed drivers that are out there and myself, given the importance of experience, because you can't get a driver's license unless you have experience. So it's special pleading when there's one standard for yourself, another standard for everybody else, without there being any relevant differences between the two. And the double sexual standard, men that are promiscuous are manly studs, women that are promiscuous are sluts. So we hear that, we may still be hearing that in 2020. Okay, the last fallacy I want to talk about is the fallacy of slippery slope. That occurs when someone falsely claims that if a certain event or phenomenon occurs, an unacceptable result will occur due to intervening causes between the first event and the terrible outcome. Uh, but it's fallacious when their intervening causes, intervening variables aren't plausible. For example, if I claim if we don't withdraw all our US troops from the Mideast, we'll be looking at nuclear war in 5 years. Okay, first of all, you have to show that if we withdraw from these countries, what will result is either political chaos, civil war, rebellions, terrorism, and then that will lead to the rebellious groups obtaining nuclear weapons, or that will lead to more countries will obtain nuclear weapons. Then you say there will be more international conflicts based on events that occur, for example, Al Qaeda bombing the World Trade Center. And then F, the final result, nuclear war. Unless you can show that each of these intervening causes are likely, it's a slippery slope. Another example, if we legalize marijuana, in 2 years the US will be overrun by opioid and meth zombies. Well, it's already legalized in some places, and the cities and communities aren't being overrun by opioid or meth heads and acting like zombies. Okay, so the critical reasoning for slippery slope is show why the intervening variables are not likely to occur. There's two more fallacies in your textbook, false cause and false analogy. We will be covering that in both of them in the second component of the class. So I'm really not going to spend time on them in this portion of the class. But since they're in the textbook, you will have to be able to recognize them. And the critical reasoning for false cause is state the real cause. And the critical reasoning for false analogy is state the relevant dissimilarities between the two things being compared. So those are the fallacies that you'll be required to label and provide the critical reasoning for in your next assignment.